So, well, welcome to our presentation, both to everybody here and online. My name is Vic Hayslip, and I am the head of Commercial Litigation Practice Group who is presenting Peter's on today. I want to thank everybody. If you've seen Peter before, then you know what you're expecting. What to expect is great. And if you hadn't, you're in for some really great entertainment. Peter, as you, if you read his stuff, you know he's got 3 books out, and in the process of doing another one. Don't know when it's going to be out, but he's in the process of writing his 4th. He's a geopolitical strategist, New York Times best-selling author. He is also a commentator occasionally on CNN and Fox, and a consultant with the U.S. Defense Department and a variety of other groups. So he has great credentials, which all coincide, and you'll see a lot of it interwoven within his presentation. I appreciate everybody's attendance, and in the world of ever-growing news events, Burr has a new announcement. We, as of this week, have new offices in both Chicago and Washington, D.C. So thank you, appreciate it. If you need help there, we know who to reach out to. But thank you, everybody, for attending. And Peter, thank you very much.
Most of what we're going to do today is talk about the economics and the structure of what's changing in the United States, but I want to do one page of security because it's a big deal. These are the bases that the Ukrainians hit last weekend, taking out 40-odd nuclear strategic bombers, things with ranges of multiple thousands of miles, who then launch cruise missiles that are tipped with nuclear warheads that go thousands of miles. Considering that the Russians have a 1,000-mile border front line with the Ukrainians, these are not weapons that were designed for Ukraine. These are weapons that were designed for the upper half of the United States in case of a general nuclear exchange. And in an hour, the Ukrainians took out 1/3 of them. The Russians no longer have the capacity to make these jets. If they wanted to build the factories to make these jets, they wouldn't get the first ones off the line within a decade. So in 1 hour, Ukraine did us more of a solid than any ally has ever done since the Normandy landings. I do not know if J.D. Vance has said thank you. We're in the middle of a transformation in military affairs that I'm still parsing through, but we know where the innovation's happening. Do your own math on that. We can discuss that later if you want me to. But for now, we all know what this is, right? This is not a policy change. This is a transformation. We haven't seen the degree of geopolitical shifts that this is triggering right now since at least the Bretton Woods Conference of 1944. We haven't seen the sort of economic transformation in this country that this will trigger since Reconstruction. And we are only now beginning to feel the edges of it. Now, if Donald Trump is correct, if he gets his way, if what he says happens, we will get our first serious trade deal negotiations beginning within another 4 months. We will get our first real deals maybe by the end of the year. They will be implemented 1 year to 2 years after that. And the first product that will come out of these new fleets of manufacturing capacities, which haven't been broken on the ground yet, by the end of his term. That's the current official plan. That's a little over optimistic considering that it took 75 years to build global manufacturing into its current form. This takes time. And in the meantime, this roil that we're in, this is the new normal itself. We're not going to emerge from it, by Trump's own words, within the next 3 years. Just file that away for future reference. In the meantime, to understand just how big of a moment this is, we really need to take a giant step back, and we need to understand the political moment that we're in. So if you're at the bottom of this matrix, you're social conservative, you want the government involved in regulating social norms in some way. If you're at the top, a social liberal, you want the government out of your personal life. If you're over here, an economic conservative, you want the government out of your wallet. I'm sure there's no one in this room like that. And if you're over here, you think the government should have its hands in people's wallets in order to remake society in some way. And you can combine these. So if you're the top right, economic, conservative, social liberal, libertarian, you look forward to the party that you're going to throw in DC, for all the bureaucrats, because you so deeply, truly treasure all the work that they have done over the years, and you really look forward to serving them that arsenic cake. Here is me. I'm a political zero. I don't know how many dozens of political surveys I've taken in my life. I've always come out dead center. Now, I think that this means that I can criticize everyone equally. Everyone else thinks it just means that I'm on the other side. So be it. Here is every political faction we have that is cohesive. Red for the Republican Alliance, blue for the Democrats, green for traditional swing voters. Or this is where we used to be. We now have the best exit polling we have ever had. And according to our last federal election, here's where we are now. It is already a different world. Now, as a political zero, when I look at this, I see that neither the Democrats nor the Republicans have the capacity to generate a plurality on their own. They have to bring in people from the outside, and neither of them are very good at doing that right now. But we are in a first past the post single member district system, which means that someone has to win. It's just a question of who loses more. And in the last federal election, the Democrats really put their shoulder into it. Give you an idea of how badly the Democrats did. At one of Trump's 5 inauguration parties, I would have had 5 too, the Village People performed. The Democrats lost the Village People. If you're on the left, I don't know if you come back from that. But the Republicans are gone too. This isn't anywhere near enough. Which means for the moment, love him or hate him, Donald Trump is the only show in town. There is no meaningful political check on executive power right now. We've been at this moment before. This is our 6th political transition. We'll get through this. These colors will move around some more, settle into a new format, but not this cycle. It's probably next cycle. Until then, it's just Donald Trump. Big step back. This is what trade used to look like. We didn't trade goods, we traded ammo. And if you saw something you wanted, you went out and you took it. You confiscated it. You colonized it. You expanded into empire. And those empires fought over resources and access and populations. Those fights brought us to world wars, which tore the entire system down, leaving it to the last people standing, the Americans, to figure out what was next. So we drew our allies together at Bretton Woods in 1944. We sent our Navy out to patrol the global oceans to allow anyone to go anywhere at any time and access any market if in exchange you signed up for the Cold War. We bought an alliance. We bribed globalization into existence. And as a side effect of us fighting the Cold War our way, we created global trade as a bribe. Never forget that globalization in its current form was what we paid to write everyone else's security policies, and it worked. And for 40 years, we had the fastest economic growth in human history as a side effect of American security policy. But then disaster struck. We won, and we had no idea what to do the next day, but someone thought we should maybe discuss our options. George Herbert Walker Bush was the guy in charge when the wall fell. He was the right person to lead the conversation about the future. He was respected on both sides of the American political aisle. He was on a first-name basis with everyone who mattered around the world. He had served in the CIA. He'd been VP for 8 years. He had served in Congress. He had been ambassador to China. He had run his own business. He was the right person at the right time with the right Rolodex and the right connections and the right set of experience, asking the right question. What do we want out of this world? And so, of course, we voted him out of office. And in every presidential election since then, we have always gone with the more strategically isolationist economically nationalist candidate, including the transitions from Trump 1 to Biden to Trump 2. Trump 1 and Trump 2 are very different dudes. We've had 6 administrations where we failed to think forward. And now we've run out of time. And that's a question of demographics. These are demographic profiles. They all follow the same pattern. Children at the bottom, young adults, mature adults, retirees at the top, men on one side, women on the other. In a normal demographic, like the top left, Nigeria, you have a lot more children than retirees. No shock there. That's largely an economic decision because when you live on the farm, kids are free labor. You have as many of them as you can put up with plus one. How you find out it's too many. And mortality builds it into a pyramid. But with globalization, people had different options. We could take manufacturing and services jobs, and none of those were on the farm. And when you move from the farm and into the city, kids are no longer free labor. You have fewer of them over time. So Nigeria is only now industrializing and urbanizing. India started that process 40 years ago. Spain started it 60 years ago. And Japan about 80 years ago. Birth rates drop, populations age, the shape of the pyramid shifts, and with it, so does the economic model. Because when you have a lot of people under age 40, it's a consumption-led system. You're building your homes, you're building your life, you're raising your kids, but your expertise is relatively limited, your income is relatively low, you have to borrow to fuel the consumption. But when you get into something like, say, Spain, the youth group is gone. The consumption peters out, but you now have decades of work experience. You're a more productive worker. Your income is higher. Your savings for retirement is higher. You go from a consumption-led system to a capital and an investment-led system. What was always going to happen about now, between 2025 and 2035, is almost all of the countries in the world that matter age past where Japan is today. It's not that we're running out of kids. We ran out of kids on a global basis in the 80s and 90s. This is the decade where we run out of working-aged adults, and the world ages into hospice. We do not, as a species, have an idea for an economic model that will work in a world that is not run on consumption, production, or investment. The game's over, and there is no globalization without consumption. There is no trade without somebody on the other side to buy what you're selling. It was always going to end about right now, which didn't necessarily mean it needed to end this year, but here we are. Now, there are 2 countries in the world that don't follow this trend, only 2. Luckily, one of them is us. A couple of reasons for that. Number one, globalization was a bribe. If we had invested our economy into the global commons and industrialized rapidly, it wouldn't have been a bribe. Nobody would have joined the party. We would have had to fight the Cold War on our own. We took more time. Second, US has a lot of elbow room. So we didn't go from farm to city. We went from farm to small town to suburb to city. And those 2 extra steps in the middle bought us 50 years. So if we keep aging at our current rate, we will not be in a Japanese-style crisis until at least 2080, maybe even later. And that assumes immigration never picks up again. That's our worst-case scenario. All right. We're waiting.
There's some good news. Some good news.
Some good news. We'll get past that, don't worry. Now, I have been waiting my entire professional life to use these words. The boomers are finally gone. As of January of this year, 2/3 of American boomers have already retired. Now, boomers being boomers, they're trying to make it about them until the last possible second. They're leaving us a couple of presents we're going to have to work through. First, capital. 2/3 of the boomers have already retired. That means they've liquidated their savings, because when you retire, if you haven't gone into relatively low velocity investments, real estate, cash, T-bills, if you're still in the high velocity stuff, stocks and bonds, and there's a market crash or a currency crash, you're done. You're moving in with your kids because you no longer have the income to regenerate your position. Well, the boomers collectively have $76 trillion in financial holdings. 2/3 have already been liquidated.
Is that the US?
That's just the US. Now, the US is as much as everyone else put together. Everyone else, remember, the demographics are worse. Yeah. So it's gone. The cost of capital, as a result, has gone up by a factor of 5 since the start of COVID. It's not the Fed, it's not Trump, it's not Biden, it's not the fiscal deficit. It's just the boomers rolling one last grenade into the room on their way out. And then there's labor. 2/3 of the boomers have already retired. They're never coming back. I'd say about 1/3 to half of today's inflation story is simply the adjustment in the labor market from a lack of supply. That's not going to get any better. Neither of these factors will, ever, because the boomers are never coming back. Now, that doesn't mean it's hopeless. It just means that we have to look for hope elsewhere. In the millennials. The oldest millennials turned 46 this year, which means in a decade, they'll be entering their mid-50s. And people aged roughly 55 to 65, that's the group that generates 70% of total private capital. So today's boomers, or excuse me, today's millennials are doing everything that every generation before has ever done. They are having kids, they are buying homes, they are getting married in that order and with a 6-year delay. But they're still doing it all. They're becoming adults. Thank God. Second problem that they will also address is labor. Not directly, they're already in the labor force. But they're going to generate tomorrow's labor force. A large generation generates a large generation. Boomers generated the millennials, are now generating Generation Alpha. All we have to do to get back to a 20-teens labor market is wait for the millennials to birth Gen Alpha, for Gen Alpha to grow up, get trained, enter the workforce. And that will happen in the tens of millions by 2045. We just have to wait. For everyone else, it's a starvation diet. All right, let's touch green power very briefly because it's over. This is a cost structure for the entire life cycle of a natural gas power plant. The blue bar at the bottom, that's how much it costs to buy the land and build the facility in the first place. That's the part you have to finance up front. The gray in the middle, it's like 3/4 of the total. That's the fuel cost over the life of the plant. And this is a model that power folks recognize. You finance a small chunk up front, then you're basically on a subscription basis. As you get paid for the power you produce, you buy more natural gas, repeat the process. This we understand, right? Nothing surprising there. This is how it works for a wind turbine. 2/3 of the cost is up front. There's no gray, there's no fuel. That's part of the attraction. But that means the blue bar has to be financed. And the cost of capital have gone up by a factor of 5 already, and it's going to double or triple again in the next 3 or 4 years as the rest of the boomers leave. And the finance will not get cheaper until the millennials swash through the system, and that is at least 10 years out, which means the functional cost of putting in green tech from a financing point of view has already moved beyond any hope of financial return. Unless there's a dramatic change in the technology, it's over globally. That's before you consider tariffs on China, which is where the panels come from, and before you consider tariffs on Europe, which is where most of the turbines come from. And that's before you consider that the federal government is getting out of the business of assisting with financing. If there's going to be anything, it has to be someplace that is either very windy or very sunny, or where a local government decides to pick up the tab for its own reasons. We are looking at a 90% reduction in installs for solar and probably a 70% reduction in wind. Done. It's over. Change the rules on the game on me. I reserve the right to change my mind. We get a different type of panel? Maybe. I don't see anything at the prototype stage right now. On the flip side, fossil fuels, things look pretty good. The 3 blue bars are the 3 different types of crude that comes out of the ground. Raw crude, something called condensates, and something called NGLs. We kind of lump them together in our statistics. So just look at the stack. The red is what we import from Canada. Now, for those of you in the oil world, this is probably a graphic you've seen in some form in the past, nothing too surprising, but I bet most of you haven't looked at it from this point of view. That line is total US consumption of oil minus refined product exports. We now produce and export an extra 5 million barrels a day of crude derived products like gasoline and jet fuel. That means our refined product exports are greater than the total oil production of all but 3 countries in human history. We have entered a fundamentally new age in North America when it comes to energy. The degree to which this dwarfs everyone else is ridiculous. It's difficult for me to come up with a set of policies at the government level that would make this not work, because 99% of shale oil production is on private land. All right, talk about the countries of the future. 4 categories here. First, the yellow. These are all the countries we're going to care about for the next 15 years. First, the yellows. These are countries that, for a mix of geographic positioning, industrial plant, good demographic structure, look pretty good. But I don't think the United States is going to have a lot to do with them. It's not that they're going to be enemies, but economic integration with these countries just doesn't make a lot of sense. I'm not saying they're going to be foes. I'm just going to say they're going to be there. They're going to be very interesting, but we're really not going to talk a whole lot. The blues, oh wait, let me give you tariff levels. The blues, this is the friends and family plan that I like to call it. We have free trade deals with these countries, or we're so close we might as well. We have pretty deep security cooperation with them. And whatever form the future takes, this is the low-hanging fruit. My concern with the current administration is that we've rolled a grenade into all of these relationships, most notably with Canada and Mexico. If we can make this work, we evolve with them into the next world in a pretty good strategic and economic position. If we fail to do that, everything's going to take an extra 20 years. The greens are my favorites. These are places that really don't go to war with one another ever, have positive demographics, have rapidly expanding industrial economies, are consumption-based, treat money like money, have sane financing, have more or less rule of law. These are the countries of our future. If you want to make a trade relationship, these are the ones you want to build it with. And after COVID, American corporates went out of their way to build up industrial links between North America and the Southeast Asian countries. That's kind of been blown up in the last 3 months. It's unclear whether it's salvageable. And then there's China, which will be dead in 10 years. Now, the tariff rate started at 54, and then it just started going up, like sometimes every hour. Now we're back at 10. But next week, the State Department is supposed to issue a ruling on who's trading with Venezuela, and then there'll be a penalty tariff that comes in. And the Senate has a bill that's supposed to also pass next week that Trump has said he likes, which will take it above 500. I don't know. We've now had 134 tariff policies since the 20th of January. No one knows what to do. It's actually, according to the current tariff policy, if you want to get rare earth magnets for your vehicles out of China, it's cheaper to build your engine and ship it to China to install the magnets, because then it's a semi-finished product and it avoids the tariffs on the way back in. We've actually incentivized the deindustrialization of the United States with the tariff policies so far, because they keep changing. I don't know where this shakes out. What I can tell you is, for the country that is most dependent upon international trade on the planet, China, this is the worst of all worlds. Their demographic means that they're no longer economically competitive because of the cost of their workforce. Their average age is now over 53. The only reason we still get stuff from them is because the physical plant is there. You can rebuild that easily, but not quickly. And that's the only lever they have in this right now. They're going to be gone before long, and that's a demographic question. Now, you've all heard about the one-child policy. You're probably aware that this is the fastest urbanization policy in human history. That's why the birth rate has now been below that of the United States since 1990. Best guess is that the major cities, the top 20 tier, that the birth rate is now less than 1/5 of replacement levels. The yellow bars are people who show up in their statistics, but now China's own official statisticians don't think those people exist. And the debate within Chinese bureaucracy is whether or not the number of missing millions is closer to 100 million, which would be the yellow bars, or 300 million. The issue is statistics. So there's certain points in your life where the government becomes aware that you're there. And in the United States, and all first world countries, there's dozens of these. Here, it's when you're born, every immunization you get, every time you enter the school year, every time you get a driver's license, every time you pay taxes, all those good things. China's not a first world country. They don't have that kind of data density. So until recently, most Chinese were not born in a hospital, so that was not a registration point. So the government only finds out you exist at 3 points before you're 25. Number one, when you get your first immunizations, and what they discovered was that doctors were getting paid per immunization reported. So they were inflating the numbers to get more money. The second point is when you enter school, and their equivalent of kindergarten. Well, what they discovered is regional governments get their subsidies from the national government based on the number of people they have. So they were inflating those numbers. Third, you remember Tiananmen Square? The Chinese government made the conscious decision that to avoid that sort of political unrest in the future, we want to segue from a blue collar to a white collar economy. So they encouraged people in the hundreds of millions to go to university. You could get value added. That means that the first time they paid taxes was when they turned 21, not when they turned 18. And about the time that first wave of college graduates were supposed to pay taxes, COVID hit, and none of the numbers made sense anyway. So it wasn't until 2024 that they realized that their data had been wrong for 27 years. Yellow bars. It's too late. Within 8 years, the Chinese will have aged into a structure that is supported by no economic theory we understand. Trump is perfectly capable of accelerating that break. We're not simply looking at the edge of the trade, the end of the trade relationship. We're looking at the end, the extinction of the Han ethnicity this century. They'll stop being a trading partner long before that. Okay, so how do they make this work? Well, there's a few things going on here. What we're looking at here is a climate terrain map. The hashes are really rough terrain where you really can't run a road. The green are tropics. The blue makes Minnesota look warm. The orange is desert. Everyone in China lives in kind of this section on the coast. Now, up north, North China Plain along the Yuan River, it's flat, it's open. You guys have all played Risk, right? Yeah. That's why no one wants to play Asia, because you can come at you from every direction. And so northern China has 3,000 years of civil war and genocide as someone tries to take over. Beijing is where it is against the desert because at least that way it's guarded from one side. Didn't consolidate until globalization, when the US broke the empires and sent the Europeans home. In the center, along the Yangtze, you have something that we would recognize. The Yangtze is basically a natural highway for commerce. And so you get cities purchased sitting along the river coasts that trade with one another, but because it's kind of cliffy, can never really invade one another. So security is paramount in the north. That's the politicos, that's the militarists. In the center, you get the financiers and the industrialists. And then down here, in the tropical coast, you have something completely different. Because the same thing happens If someone from Illinois goes into Louisiana, as what happens when a Brit goes into the Niger Delta, as happens when someone from Beijing goes down to Macau. They get bit by strange bugs, they start bleeding strange colors, and then they die horribly. It's a disease belt. It's where the secessionists live. Getting these three zones to be part of the same political and economic entity is a haul. And so the Chinese have done two things. One, they've built a national security state that beats the crap out of anyone who steps out of line. They're very good at that. And they bribe everybody. They pour a bottomless supply of capital into any venture if it ensures that people have jobs, not productive jobs, just jobs. Because if they have jobs, they don't get together in large groups and go on long walks together. Something the government's very conscious of. That's how they got their jobs. How much money does that take? Glad you asked. This is the private credit curve for the United States. All sources of capital to all destinations. That bump in the middle, that's the subprime build. We doubled total private credit in 7.5 years. Too much, too fast, got a financial bubble, it popped, we had the Great Recession. Same data, different scale. This is what we call a financial crisis. This is what the Europeans call a financial crisis. This is Greece. 7-fold increase in 7.5 years. Eventually knocked 60% off of GDP, twice as bad as what the US went through in the Great Depression. And here's China today. There are any number of things about the Chinese system that I worry about. Their strength, their durability, these do not make my list. We are in a race. Can we double the size of our industrial plant before they break? I have a lot of beefs with this administration. My biggest one, though, is by doing the tariff war in the way that it's been done, Donald Trump has robbed us of that most precious of geopolitical commodities, time. This is easily going to break the Chinese system before we are even remotely ready. And they won't go alone because there's not enough time to adapt, and the connections are not just about us. These are the countries that the Chinese import product from. Now, some of these are going to be pretty self-explanatory. Australia for food, Saudi Arabia for oil, Germany for industrial equipment, Russia for oil and food, Brazil for food, the United States for energy and food, commodities or inputs that they need to exist as a modern country. But check out East Asia. We forget that the Chinese are not just the world's largest trade country. They are the tip of the spear for a multinational system that produces goods. They do the low end, they do the assembly. And when you do the assembly, that means you're the last stop on the way to the end market. That's why we feel it so much. That's why the numbers are so big. But it's not just them. And the same thing for the Chinese export list. So when this goes, it also takes Japan and Korea and Taiwan and Vietnam with them, countries that we were perfectly honestly relying upon to be with us in whatever's next. Will they bounce back in time? I hope so. I'm not sure anymore. And every country we don't bring into whatever's next is a lot of work that we have to do that we're not designed for. All right, let's talk about us. These are demographic profiles broken down by race. So the orange, those are the gringos. The blue, those are the Hispanics. The yellows are the African Americans. We're looking here at the three parts of the country that, demographically speaking, are in the best shape. So the classic South, the Midwest, where I'm from, the Mountain West, where I live now. A few things to look at here. First of all, see how they've all got a bite out of the bottom? Remember the millennials? Doing everything that everyone's ever done before, but with a 6-year gap? That's the gap. So 20, 30, 40, 60 years from now, whenever they get to this gap, gets to whatever stage of their life that matters, entering the workforce, becoming capital generators, retiring, It's all going to be shaped by the millennials taking some time off. Top left is Arizona, bottom left is the Northeast, top is Texas, bottom is California. Let's see, where should we start with this? Yeah, okay, so the Northeast. It's the oldest and the fastest aging part of the country. California, got a big bulge right here. You know what this is? Millennials. We've all heard the stories, millennials going out to the coast for their youth experience. Well, there's two types of millennials. There's those that match the stereotype, and there's those that hate the ones that match the stereotype. The ones who graduated from school early, who went straight into the workforce and get a bad rap for the millennials that we all, love and hate, love to hate. Well, starting about 7 years ago, the millennials split because they all went out to the coast. But the good millennials realized that they can't afford to raise a family in California. And they moved back home or to Dallas or someplace with better economic prospects for them. The bad millennials stayed. And it shows up in worker productivity data. Now, check out Texas and California. These are the two most similar demographics in the country, not just by shape, but by race. So anyone who ever tries to tell you that race is anything other than the starting point of a conversation about politics is trying to smoke you in some way. And then there's Arizona. That's actually a pretty good demographic, all things considered, for a first world country. You see, there's this weird belief in the United States that Arizona is full of old people. It's not true. Arizona is full of old white people. And that's a different sort of issue. They don't have a labor crunch. They have a bilingual training limitation. That's a lot easier to fix. All right, let's talk about where we're going to be in the next few months. This is a manufacturing graphic for transport. So whether it's autos, aerospace, jets, trains, everything is in here. And this is not percentage of manufacturing. This is not percentage of the workforce. This is total state product. Because of the tariffs we have in place, the dark blue states and the mid blue states are already in a manufacturing recession. And the ones in the lighter blue are kind of on the edge. The tariffs have gone back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, so it hasn't really settled. If the higher end of the tariffs, as they were originally envisioned, come back in 4 weeks, which is when Trump says they're going to come back, those lighter blues fall into a manufacturing recession as well. In terms of consumption, it's all about income. So this is broken down by income levels with blue at the top, then green, then yellow, and orange down below. So multiple stories here. First, let's talk agricultural tariffs. Trump keeps threatening it. It hasn't happened yet, keeps threatening it, a 40% tariff on agricultural imports. Well, the bottom quintile of Americans by wealth spend over 1/3 of their income on food. And if you get a 40% tariff on food, the things that we import are not things that we are capable of producing. Agriculture is very seasonal. It's very locational. You can't grow coffee if you're not in Hawaii. You can't grow wheat if you're not in the Midwest. So the food that we bring in, if we put a tax on that, just goes directly to bottom lines, and the bottom fifth of the population falls into recessionary consumer activity almost overnight. For the blues, the top 10% of the population by wealth, their consumption is directly indexed to the value of the stock market. And we all know what that's been doing of late. So the tariffs in their current form are hitting the bottom and the top very hard. We haven't had enough time for it to show up in the data because retail sales, which are the most reliable measure here, are produced with a 7-week delay. By the time it's reflected in the data, it's already going to be here. It's probably already here, but something that's a little closer to home that everyone can identify with is vehicle sales. This is a look at the top 100 models that are driven by Americans. So you've got the maker, the vehicle type, where the engine comes from, where the transmission comes from, and then the percentage of the content in the car as a whole that comes from outside North America, starting with the ones that are almost purely American made up there and coming down to the ones that are almost pure imports down below. Vast oversimplification with this sort of data, but as a rule, the ones in the good category, the first category, have seen their prices go up by $2,000 to $6,000. This group by 6 to 12, and this group by 12 to 20. And this is including the current break that we're on in the tariffs. If the full numbers come back in another month, like Trump's threatening, those numbers go up. And if it costs you $10,000 or more to get your car, people are going to buy fewer cars. The United States economy is consumption driven. 65 to 70% of total economic activity is by what we spend. And this hits what is typically the second largest line item in everyone's lives. As for timing, we're about there. April 2 is when the tariffs first went into place. There was a big surge as everyone tried to get in front of it. But the last ships left China a long time ago, and this is when the last ships pre-tariff arrived in our major ports. It's a question of inventory now. Did people, companies, firms, build up enough inventory to outlast however long the disruptions are? We won't know until we don't have stuff on the shelves. So far, it's holding. But so far, it hasn't even been a month since LA ran dry. The first shipments from China with the exemptions are only now loading. They won't get here for another 5 weeks. So we're in this kind of nether region right now. Well, July looks rough unless the inventories hold, because we won't get full product back on a nationwide basis until September. And that assumes nothing else changes. And if there's one thing that Trump has guaranteed, is that a lot is still going to change. Remember, 134 tariff policies since 20 January. He threatened 4 fresh ones this morning. He implemented a new one yesterday. Enjoy the ride. If you want to look for a number that will give you a general barometer on where we're going, good or bad, this is the one. This is data from the Fed, total construction spending into manufacturing capacity. This is the number that determines whether we're getting ready for China's fall, whether Donald Trump's policies are working or not. During COVID, it was flat as you would expect. Under Biden, it tripled. There are a lot of things about Biden I didn't like. And only about maybe a quarter of this is because of federal spending. But it did change the conversation about getting ready for what's next. Since Trump has come back, it's stayed where it is, but it hasn't gone up. No new projects have broke ground. People are just finishing what was already on the docket. If this number goes up sharply, we'll know that either the business community is taking very seriously where we're going, or Donald Trump's policies are working. I don't care what the rationale is as long as it goes up. If it goes down, it means we're de-industrializing at a time that we need to double everything that we do. All right. I picked Brooke Rollins, Agricultural Secretary, because she's also, I think, the smartest member of the cabinet. So I think it's instrumental for people to understand what her first week on the job was like. Now, she's smart. Doesn't mean I think she's qualified, but she's more qualified than most of them. She actually has a degree in agricultural development from Texas A&M. Good school, good degree for that school. But then, like a lot of us who have been white-collar educated, we went into different things. And she went straight into politics and never really went back to the farm. So her first day on the job, Trump fired the first 1,600 people in the federal government, the top spots, the secretaries, the undersecretaries, the assistant secretaries, the deputy assistant secretaries, the deputy assistant undersecretaries. We need different names for these people. But basically, all of the people who are the institutional knowledge. Normally, that top layer obviously goes every time. But whoever's down below the civil servants who have been there for a couple of days, a couple decades, they stay because they're apolitical and they keep the trains running. They know where all the institutional knowledge is. They're the leadership core of all the departments. It's very rare for more than 2 or 3% of them to be turned over every administration. Trump fired every single one of them across the entire federal bureaucracy, basically decapitated the entire thing. Brooke Rollins comes in. There's nobody there. There's a bird flu crisis going in. People have already died. And Doge got there the day before she did and fired all the temporary workers. Now, in agriculture, they don't call them temporary. They call them seasonal, because the workforce you need for planting is not the same you need for harvesting, is not the one you need for packaging, is not the one you need for finance. So most of the jobs in agriculture come and go. And the same for a bureau that supports it. So the hurricane hunters were gone. The forest firefighters were gone. The loan officers were gone. The bird flu task force was gone. Luckily, the last member of the task force, on her way out the door, ran into Secretary Rollins on the way in the door. She's like, you really need to talk to Bob down in genetics. So she goes and she talks to Bob, and she gets the download about bird flu. Looks around for other people to help her make policy. There's no one there. So she comes up, reaching back 30 years to a class that she took at A&M, with a solution. We're going to vaccinate all the birds. Now, based on the audience, that either gets laughter or, oh, that's a good idea. There's nothing in between. So let me explain to you, as was explained to her by a chicken farmer 2 days later, what vaccinating birds looks like. It's a shot. So you pick up a chicken. You have to put the chicken in a different enclosure because they're not going to self-segregate. And then you go back and you pick up another chicken. And you do that over and over and over. Typical chicken operation in the United States, 3 million birds. You had a team of 40 doing nothing else, immunizing one flock will take you 12 months. Laying hens only produce for 18 months. So Rollins, not knowing what she didn't know, but willing to listen and learn, like, oh, that was a bad plan. Apologies. I'm just going to provide some financing to help people bridge through this. And that's someone who isn't cocky, who is actually making an effort. And that's the best she can come up with because there's no support. Those top 1,600 positions, only 5% of them have been filled, all by flunkies who don't know what they're doing. There's another 5% that are kind of on the wait list with the Senate, but we have a big, beautiful bill working through Congress, which is absorbing everyone's bandwidth because it's 17 bills in one. They haven't even gotten to the confirmation process yet. So we're paying for a full federal government, but we're not getting a federal government, which means we have to talk about this guy. Herbert Hoover, generally considered to be one of the 3 worst presidents in American history, largely because of the role he played in kicking off the Great Depression with tariff policy. By the way, the tariff policies that he implemented in terms of value per GDP, about 1/5 of what we've done in the last 3 months. I'm not saying it's a direct comparison. It is not. The world is very different. But we kind of approach this from 2 angles. First, the historical process. In the United States, the Great Depression took place in 3 overlapping waves. First, you had the big wave of tariffs and the destruction and demand that came from that. Then you had the separation of the world into trading blocks and this destruction of demand that happened from that. And third, and the one we really don't like talking about here, is the anti-Americanism that came from that, because people blamed him for starting it all off. So around 1935, the world started to knit itself back together. We weren't invited. And that cost us an extra 10% of GDP. Now, again, it's different now, because if you go back to 1929, we built things differently. It used to be that if you were in Germany, all of the parts were built in Germany. The final thing was assembled in Germany, and then the finished product was shipped out. That's not how we do it now, certainly not in North America. We have an intermediates product trade that is 3 times the value of our finished product trade. We do the things we do best. So the Canadians do spark plugs, we do the transmissions, the Mexicans do the body, and so on. If you take just the intermediate trade, just in North America today, the volume of that, the value of that in inflation index terms back to 1929 is over 5 times global intermediate product trade. Tariffs are a lot harder on intermediate product trade because it doesn't just hit one supply chain, it hits them all at the same time. So how Trump factors NAFTA into whatever else he does hugely matters. Now, I would argue, I think most economic historians today would argue that Hoover gets a bit of a bad rap. Not that he was a great president, but more that while he started the Great Depression, it wasn't really his fault because it was probably going to happen anyway. In the 30 years leading up to it, the world was industrializing unevenly. A lot of the disruption that eventually led to the Depression and World War II was already cooked in. We had countries like Germany that were industrializing very rapidly, countries like France that were only kind of having one foot in, places like Poland that had none. And we were getting imbalances in what we considered to be normal patterns. What he did was kind of kick the rock over the edge, but the rock was already kind of right at the edge. It's kind of the world we're in today. Globalization was always going to end. We're in late capitalism. I don't know what's next. But we didn't have to kick the rock over the edge today. We didn't have to forward load all of this. And now, instead of fixing this with some friends over the next 8 years, we might have to do it ourselves over the next 20 to 30. And that's a chapter of history that we were writing right now. All right, if you're looking for more of my nonsense, that's the QR code that will take you to the newsletter and the video log. I tried to keep that as short as possible so you can all throw really awkward questions at me because I don't want boring ones. We're going to start over there. He's ready.
If you would, just raise your hand. Somebody's going to bring you a microphone. And thank you, Peter, first. Let's give you a round of applause. Appreciate your presentation. Peter, what if China's aware of their predicament? And so their only escape valve is war. And so what if the tariffs are about forcing U.S. manufacturers to, retool the supply chain so that we don't get caught with our pants down?
Sure. Well, let's start with two things. Number one, the tariffs, the intent of the tariffs is clearly to renationalize the supply chain. I don't have a problem with that goal. Whether or not it's being done competently, that's a different conversation. There's a lot of ways you can make that happen. Tariffs can be part of that, sure. I don't think we're going to have a war with China. I am of a small minority of people in my world who see that. 6 years ago, I have it on very, very good authority from people who were in the Chinese Politburo at the time that Xi was fully aware of what sort of a war with the United States would be. Remember, this is the country that is most dependent on international trade in human history. Just for a couple of data points, they import 70% of their energy, they import a third of their food, and they import 80% of the stuff they need to grow their own. So if there's a war and their military can't project power, their ships are basically a coastal navy, no food and no energy. They would be looking at industrial national collapse in under a year without us having to close anywhere near the coastline. They knew that. 6 years ago is also when Chairman Xi shot the Chinese equivalent of me and fired his last advisors. And for the last 6 years, he's been making policy in a black box with no input whatsoever, and he is now the least informed world leader. I don't know what that does to your brain, but it can't be great. So by the math, a war with China would end the Han ethnicity very, very quickly. But I can't rule it out. And that's just, for me, one more reason why we need this industrialization drive as soon as possible. Because the other people on the other side of the line, they're not just dying, they're losing their minds. And anything that we're dependent upon them for, we will lose.
Yeah. Question. You started talking about Russia and Ukraine briefly, sure, and I kind of thought you were going that way. But can you come back and address that a little bit?
I figured we'd address the economic situation nationwide rather than go back into Ukraine. Is there something specifically you're interested in, or just kind of an over once?
Just where you think it's going.
Sure. Okay. So, it's been 3.5 years. I credit myself with being one of the few people who saw it coming. I saw it coming 12 years ago. I predicted the year that it was going to happen. And I was probably the most optimistic in my world for people who thought Ukraine wouldn't just fold. And even I thought it was going to be over in a year. 3 years on, we've all reassessed. We were all wrong again and again and again and again and again. The thing is that we're going through what's called a revolution in military affairs. We're applying technologies completely unrelated to the military sphere to the military sphere in many ways for the first time. Breakthroughs in material science, digitization, energy transfer. Drones are just the very, very leading tip of it. And we have seen over and over and over again, the Ukrainians pull victory from the jaws of defeat, with the attack over the weekend just being the most recent example. There was nothing about that attack that from a technological point of view is new. That was just audacity. Loading up the drones into Home Depot sheds, putting them on the back of flatbed tractors, driving them 3,000 miles into central Siberia, and then standing back and hitting a button so that they go. Cool. So, some great tradecraft, but nothing really new. Here's my bottom problem for Ukraine. Ukraine has an industrial base and a population that is less than a quarter that of Russia's. Any battle where the Ukrainians don't inflict at least 4 times as many casualties as they take is a battle that in the long run Ukraine's lost. And that's before you consider that the Chinese are basically giving the Russians access to the entire Chinese industrial plant. This is still Russia's war to lose. But Ukraine is trying to reinvent war as they go, and they're doing a pretty good job of it. I think the turning point will happen pretty soon, because if Trump does what he says he wants to do, we'll be out of NATO very soon. And then the Europeans are going to have to go all colonial on Russia. We all remember what that looks like, right? And if you take European industrial know-how and capital and apply it to the Ukrainian situation, the Ukrainians have already made it clear that anyone who puts boots on the ground in Ukraine gets full access to every technology that we're developing in real time. That's a different sort of war. I don't know how it's going to go because it's being invented, but I'm watching.
So when Trump started doing his tariffs, there was a lot in the press about triple decline. The stock market, the bond market, and the dollar.
Yeah.
And speculation about capital leaving
Sure.
the U.S. capital market. I'm curious about how you see that playing out, because you're now paying over $1 trillion a year in interest, and that's like, I'm wondering how vulnerable you think.
Sure. Let me give you the cop-out first and then my best stab at the answer. We're not going to have data on what this looks like for another 3 years. It just takes that long to resolve the current account database. Don't know for sure. Best guess. The European money had been coming here at a rate of about $1 trillion a year. That has fully reversed, and it's now $1 trillion a year pullout, because there's a recognition in Europe that they are going to need the money to build out their own defense plant. Now, there's a lot of complications that come from that in any number of ways, but from our point of view, that's $1 trillion a year of financing that is no longer there. The Europeans also have a lot of sunk investment in the United States that are at the beginnings of being liquidated. And so if you had asked me a year ago what was going to happen to European finance, I would have said it was all going to move in over time, that would eventually be $100 trillion. Now we're looking at doing something else that is obviously going to be bad for our bottom line in the long run. The Asian money has no alternative. They have nowhere else to go. They're certainly not going to go to Europe, so it's still coming here. The question short term is, what do the Chinese do? The Chinese like to make a big show of selling debt, our debt, but usually what happens is they sell it in Hong Kong and then buy it back in Hong Kong. And then all of a sudden it's a third-party statistic and we lose track of it. So I don't think there's a lot, excuse me, I don't think there's a lot of movement there. That just leaves the Middle East. The Halawa run, the Dubaization of Middle Eastern finance, that's full. You can only invest so much in a place knowing you're going to have a 0% return. That's over. So it's really just the Europe stuff, thank you, that is a wiggle room right now. I am more concerned with what happens with American finance directly. Because it's not so much an issue of whether $1 trillion from here or from there comes or doesn't come. It's a question of how we put our money in places. The federal government under Trump, ran the largest deficits we have ever had as a percent of GDP before COVID. The current budget, the mega bill that's coming through, will increase that. I see no appetite in Congress on either side of the aisle, because Biden knew how to spend money too, to get that under control at all. And with the baby boomers retiring and going from taxpayers to tax takers, there's no reason to expect the demographics to give us any advantage whatsoever. So the question then becomes, as we lose confidence in the financial system, is there a break? Not this year, not next year, not the year after, because there's not an alternative. Europe's an export union. Their currency will never go global. Japan is over the hill. They're never coming back. And if there's one thing everyone in the world agrees upon, it's that the Brits should never be in charge of anything ever again. And the yuan isn't convertible. The largest non-US hard currency is Canada. And no. So there's no alternative. And as long as there's no alternative, the US can get away with things it normally wouldn't be able to. So is it something I kind of watch from the edges? Sure. But this is a long-term issue more than 20 years from now, because it would take at least 20 years for a new currency or currency block to form in the first place, and then get wide enough that people would want to use it as a store of value. And with deglobalization now happening full speed, I don't even see that as a possibility. So it's not an issue until our debt passes a proportional point that is worse than where Japan is now. Because Japan dealt with all of these issues 30 years ago badly. They now have a national debt stack that's 500% of GDP. And they're not the global currency, and they're still there. So I don't know where the top level is. I don't know where this breaks. But we can roughly quadruple from where we are before I get worried. It's not the answer I like giving.
So mine's a two-parter, so I'm sorry for cheating. But so I ended early with like the rise of generative AI and college.
Don't worry about AI, it's not going to happen.
Never mind. That's the second part answered then.
Yeah, okay, AI, okay, quick question. So you guys remember postage stamps when we still had mail? A graphics processing unit is the chip that is used in AI. It wasn't designed for AI. It was designed for gamers to run graphics, but it can run multiple things in parallel, which is why it's good for AI language learning model training. And all of the data centers that we have at the run AI basically run tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions, tens of millions of GPUs. We have yet to design fully the first AI chip. They're hoping to have that finished this year. GPUs, not to mention the next generation AI chips that they're hoping for, are the most sophisticated manufacturing system on the planet. There are 30,000 pieces to the supply chain, and there are 9,000 companies involved. And within that, there are 4,500 single point failures. If you miss one of the 4,500, you don't get a chip. So the idea that we can even have mild deglobalization and still have AI is silly. So what will probably happen is we're going to lose the ability to do what's called extreme ultraviolet lithography, which is the high-end stuff that happens in the Netherlands, or the ones who make the machines. And we're going to go back to an older tech called deep ultraviolet. And deep ultraviolet kind of maxes out in capacity at about a 14 nanometer chip. Right now, the GPUs we're using are in the 2 to 3 range. So if you go back to a 14 nanometer chip, it is a lot less processing power and takes a lot more energy per process and generates a lot more heat. So you need 5 times as many chips and 5 times as much power to do the same unit of calculation. So we're looking at a 25 times increase to get the AI that we had in January of 2024. And that's probably where we'll be stuck until 2040.
Yeah, we have an online question. Can you speak to our country's current approach to allies like Canada, European countries, the UK, and Ukraine, and if there's a negotiation strategy that the public may not be aware of?
Okay, let me start with the last part, the negotiating strategy. Once a few weeks ago, excuse me, I was having a conversation with somebody who's pretty high up in MAGA world. I don't like him. He doesn't like me, but we find one another useful, so we still talk. And I was just explaining my frustrations, like, I can't assess this because I don't know where it's going. I don't know what the goal is. And he's like, oh, Peter, what happened tomorrow had no impact on what happens today, much less what happened yesterday has no impact on what happens today, much less tomorrow. There is no plan. There's no goal. There's just the now. I just about hung myself right there. He was in the Oval Office at 1 p.m. on April 2nd, Tariff Day. And he said they hadn't even started making up what the numbers were going to be. And if you're an ally that depends upon this decision-making process for your security, you really only have one option, and that's to go your own way. Now, Ukraine is providing us with a theoretical template that is being built in real time that is very loosey-goosey. It's not clear it's replicable. It's not clear that it's applicable, and it's not clear that it'll work. There's only one other option if you think you're going to be at war with the Russians within 5 years. You don't have time to build air defense and tanks and jets. You have enough time to build some nukes. So Germany, Poland, Sweden, Finland have all started the open public conversation of what sort of nuclear deterrent do we need for when the Russians come. Canada has started that conversation about us. I don't like the way that this is going.
By the way, it's good to see you smiling. I was a little worried about you back in March. You seem to be
rough.
Yeah, you seem to be in a better place now. And not to stop that from happening, but could you talk about the Middle East a little? Specifically, is there a way to bring some stability to Israel, Gaza, and Syria?
So the only reason that we have had a Syria is because when colonialization ended, there were pieces left over that nobody wanted. The Jews took Israel. Jordan was a UK client state. The Turks took the Hatay, and Iraq took Mesopotamia. And what was left over, no one else wanted. And so it got smashed together in this thing called Syria. It's 7 different geographic regions with 6 major ethnicities. It does not hold. That's why the Assad regime was so rough, because they basically had to execute their way to stability. The new government that is in there now has all of those same problems, but without Russian backing, without Iranian backing, without Western backing, without funds, without oil, without food. So to think that it's going to cohere is a bit of a stretch. It'll probably become just a general stateless area. Think Afghanistan, but with a little bit of a coast. Gaza is an open air concentration camp. It's not that the Israelis are executing people in the streets or anything, but there's no food production, there's no energy production, there's no transport arteries, there's no trade, there's no industry. It's just a wall with people in it. And in that environment, when you disrupt the food flows, people get desperate and they have a choice between dying or fighting. And so they fight. And so Hamas today probably has 4 times the number of fighters that they did when the war started. And I don't see a way through that because there's 2.5 million people living in Gaza. There's no place they can go. They're at the edge of a desert, surrounded by more desert. And so the conversations that the Trump administration has had once this was laid out to them is, hey, anybody want to take 1 million Palestinians? And there haven't been any takers. The current idea, I'm not suggesting they're going to settle on this because it's not feasible either, is to forcibly ship them to eastern Libya and let them die in the desert around Benghazi. And considering Benghazi is the secondary source of radical jihadism in the world, from my point of view, what that would do is take 1 million recruits and put them into an Al-Qaeda style incubator. So I wouldn't recommend that. And then there's Israel. Israel has a political system that is significantly different from ours. So with ours, you vote for a specific person who is running to represent a specific physicality and a specific number of people. And whoever gets the most votes, they get the seat. It's not how it works in Israel. In Israel, you vote for an idea. And whoever gets the most votes for their idea gets a proportional number of seats within the parliament. And so they've got like 185 billion parties now. And every government is a coalition of no one who's gotten more than 20% of the vote. And the problem they have is that there are several parties in the current parliament and the last one, and the one before that, and the one before that, and the one before that, and that think that the real problem with the Holocaust is it didn't target the Palestinians. And anything that anyone does that might alleviate the suffering in Gaza, they drop the government and we have fresh elections. So no, sorry. I don't see how this gets better anytime soon. Best guess is the Netanyahu government is basically going to shrink Gaza by about 10%, put a 1 kilometer buffer around the whole thing, and then break it into cantons with patrol lines in between, and then run pylons down into the ground at least 100 feet all the way around so there can't be tunnels, and then just box them up. And once that is done, whoever is still alive can start getting foreign aid again to keep them alive. That seems to be the current plan. The West Bank's fine. They can grow food there. There's water.
Peter, I've got a question. Having listened to you over the years, we see the maps you did with the Soviets and when it was the Soviets and the lines of attack and why they kept trying to expand to have protectable passes that they could defend. I think everybody that was, when the Ukrainian war started, thought it was like you, it was going to be over pretty quick. A year would be amazingly long. If they've had that much difficulty subduing Ukraine alone, I mean, they're not idiots. Do you think it's realistic that they think they could battle all of Europe or all of Europe and the US and last or survive?
Two things. Number one, they still have the industrial advantage, and that's before you consider the Chinese. So this is still their war to lose. Second, the rules of the game are changing. I mean, yes, the Russians have probably lost over half now of their pre-war Soviet stockpile of tanks. We're talking like 8,000 tanks have been destroyed. That's more tanks than the entire Western Alliance has ever had, even during World War II. But as we've learned in the last 2 years, tanks are not all that anymore. And the Russian industrial base for the new technologies outmasses the Ukrainian industrial base for the new technologies by a factor of 5. And again, before you consider the Chinese or the Iranians or the North Koreans. So the Russians are building this hybrid military, starting from a very numerically large start, but now grafting in the new technologies as they're being invented, and the Europeans aren't. So everything's in a blender from this analysis right now, and I have no idea how it's going to go. But the fact is, if you ignore the fact that the Russians have lost 1 million men, big thing to kind of put to the side there, everything else about the Russian system is so much stronger than it was 3.5 years ago.
Okay. You said before that we need to increase our electrical capacity by 50%, I think, for onshoring.
Probably double here.
Is that still the case? And how can we even meet the onshoring?
Yeah, that is now impossible. What, for example, Southern Company in the room right now? I mean, they're kind of everywhere. So what Southern Company and all the other utilities are discovering, especially in this part of the country, is that a lot of them put out orders years ago during COVID for transformers from China. They discovered there was a 4-year wait list. Those aren't coming. So we need to build out the manufacturing capacity to build that stuff. And the idea that we could do that quickly without Mexico is hilarious. So we are going to have brownouts and blackouts as a regular feature of the system during the transition to however long this takes us. About the only bright spot I have in that is, ironically, China. So you guys remember when Biden got his skirt all ruffled over EVs last year, and he put on that 100% tariff? So we don't take Chinese EVs, and neither do the Europeans, and neither do the Japanese, and neither do the Brazilians, and neither do everyone shut them out of their market. But the Chinese had already built the industrial plant, and it had already started building the battery systems. So they took the battery systems that they already built, started linking them into series and container units and shipping them off as grid storage. And so in the United States, last year, the single largest component for new power plants was actually batteries, Chinese batteries that were subsidized, that got in before the tariffs hit. That buys you a lot of flexibility because you can run your coal power plant full tilt during low demand, charge up the batteries, and then discharge them during the day when the industrial need is up. So that has actually bought us some flexibility. But the overall power build out that we need to do, yeah, we're way behind. And I don't see a way to close that loop very quickly. It takes a couple of years minimum to build the industrial plant that's necessary that can then handle transformer construction. That's transformers. That's the bottleneck that we have to get over somehow. Now, we build more than anyone else. Mexico's in the number 2 spot. Germany's in the number 3 spot. It's not that there's nothing to work from. It's just the volume we need is huge.
I have an online question. Somebody said, I'm in charge of supply chain for a major industrial contractor. I am curious on your thoughts on material shortages as well as labor shortages for this year and next. Has your forecast for the industrial construction declined significantly for the next 5 years?
The demand is unchanged. The demand forecast is unchanged. If anything, it's become compressed. And so getting access to everything you need, whether it's land or capital or copper, has sharpened. It's kind of hard for me to answer it with any more detail without knowing what kind of materials we're talking about. I would just argue that the single biggest bottleneck is in processed materials. So turning iron ore into steel, turning bauxite into aluminum, turning copper ore into copper, turning lithium ore into concentrate, those kind of things. And the new tariff we just got yesterday doubled the tariffs on steel and aluminum. It's really, really hard to build industrial infrastructure without steel and aluminum. And if you raise the cost of that, you slow everything else down.
Are there any continuing concerns regarding like the Chinese investments in Africa or other alliances between Europe, Asia, and Africa?
I don't worry about this nearly as much as most people do. Remember the capital chart and how much money the Chinese just waste on things? Belt and Road is kind of in that category. There are limited opportunities in China for getting your money out into a jurisdiction where money is treated as money as opposed to a political good that the government controls. And so whenever somebody has an opportunity, they take it. So we see a Bitcoin rush out the door and then they close that down. And then it's an FDI rush and then they close that down. And then it's a currency issue where you can just smoke out currency and then they shut that down. Every couple of years, we see something fresh. Belt and Road was one of those from 4 years ago. So what Belt and Road really is bureaucrats found a way to get money out. And so you would get bureaucrats going to Angola and bid on an oil field that was only worth $1 billion and they'd pay $3 billion. And then they'd get a kickback. Apply that across $1 trillion of investment. So what happened then about 3 years ago when COVID was still raging, especially in China, is the order came down from Xi. He's like, okay, time to collect on those debts. And the ambassadors fanned out to all the Belt and Road countries and said, hey, none of these were grants. These were all loans. You got to pay us back now. The Kenyans had the best response. They just started laughing. And they kept laughing until the ambassador left the room. Only 2 countries are honestly trying to pay it back. Sri Lanka, the government fell, and Pakistan because they don't have a choice. Everyone else is just walking away. Now, that will have diplomatic implications for a country that won't be there in 10 years.
Yeah, circling back to war with China, are you saying
you really want a war with China?
No, not really, but I'm a little worried about China invading Taiwan. Are you saying that doesn't happen like they want to?
I wouldn't rule it out. Yeah. However,
what does that look like for us when that happens?
Well, okay, let me walk you through the logic, then we'll talk about what if it happens anyway. If there's a war, the embargo happens, China faces a collapse. If there's not a war, if China succeeds and even captures the industrial plant intact, they don't know how to use it. China can't run their own semiconductor fab facilities. They have to bring in primarily Americans to do that. So the idea that they can operate the world's most sophisticated ones, no. It's not just an issue of hardware, it's an expertise issue. In addition, all of the designs come from Japan and the United States. So we would have to actively underwrite a Chinese occupation of Taiwan and force 6-figure salary engineers in Taiwan to work for the Chinese. So many ways that doesn't work. Say it happens anyway. 30,000 supply chain steps in the semiconductor supply chain for the high-end stuff. Taiwan's special. Taiwan's important. Taiwan is where all of those steps come together, but Taiwan's not the value add. Taiwan, in the words of the people who do the design for the semiconductors, are the world's best instruction followers. Because what happens is you have an American company that designs the chips hand in hand with the company that wants to buy the chips. They go together to Taiwan. They walk through all the technicals. They build a book with several thousand pages of how to do it. TSMC then takes that book, puts it out to their ecosystem of local suppliers and packagers and testers and producers, and they expand it and earmark it until it's several tens of thousands of pages. And then they bring it back to the designer to make sure it all works. And then the designer goes off to get all the stuff lined up. So logistically, everything is where it needs to be at the right time. And in TSMC's fab facilities, they only put it all together. I'm not trying to say that Taiwan's not important. It's obviously an indelible, unavoidable step, but so are the other 4,499. You only have to break one and we don't have chips. So one way or another, we have to get by without AI for the 15 years it'll take us to rebuild the supply chain. That's assuming we bring Canada and Mexico and Japan and Taiwan and Korea and all the rest with us. If we don't, we will never have high-end semiconductors ever again. It takes everyone. It is the most sophisticated, gangly supply chain humans have ever created, and there is no way we can do it by ourselves. No one can.
I'm curious, because of what is happening in the world and how you've been this student collecting information over time, quite a bit of time now.
A little bit.
How difficult is it to get information and to do what you do and actually make these interpretations and figure out what possibly could happen? Okay. Is it becoming more scarce?
Yes. So there's three sides to that. The first is with the media. As technology has become more invasive, the media has become less quality. Part of it is the transition from what used to be that every news bureau in the world, including, just to pick something from my home state, the Des Moines Register, had multiple foreign bureaus. Everybody did. And stories would flow in and they would have editors and copy editors there. Well, as the technology got better and communication became more frictionless, those foreign staffs got slimmed down. They got rid of the copy editors. They got rid of the editors. Eventually, they got rid of the reporters and just went with stringers. And now we don't even have the stringers. And so everything just kind of fell in on itself until you just have your hub back in where your primary publishing point happens to be. So we lost eyes on topic, and the ability to call on something went away because everyone became a hyper specialist in whatever it was they were doing, and not a lot of people compared notes anymore. Eventually, opinion displaced fact and investigation, and we now get what is today CNN and Fox News as the better ones. That's problem one. Problem two is, of course, politics. When opinion means everything, opinion becomes fact. And we really care about our opinions. So it's really hard to find people who are knowledgeable about more than one thing. And if you don't already have a multidisciplinary context behind you, you can't call. They might not even be lying to you. They might be using facts as they understand them, but you can't put it into a broader story. And then third, so many things are changing at the same time. It's like the Ukraine discussion with military stuff, that's just one example. This is happening in every economic sector as every supply chain we know is bending and snapping and remaking itself in real time. I can't keep up. This is probably my final year of doing this because I can give you what I got. I've got a lot of context behind me. I've got a really deep understanding of how it all worked. But we're departing from the world I know. And I don't think a team of 100 could keep up. And I don't have a team of 100.
One more question.
Interesting.
Okay. Does the immigration policies currently that this administration have give you any concern regarding like the demographics of the United States going forward or growth or trajectory?
Sure. So for the last 30 years in the United States, about 40% of our population growth rate, has been from immigrants or the children of immigrants. And immigration, we still don't have good data for the last 3 months because we won't until next year. At the moment, let's just say that it's on an ebb. We're in this really weird situation where the world is breaking and there are people with lots of skills and lots of places looking for a place to put down roots and switch sides, and we've closed the doors. It's a really inconvenient time for that. Now, the demographic profile, remember that bite out of the bottom? That's birth rate from people who are already here. If you want to grow via immigration, and putting aside things like the H-1B visas for highly skilled people, that's a different bucket. If you just want the numbers to get bigger, you have to let it trickle in over the long term so it's not a culturally destabilizing event. So to use the German example, for Germany to hold where it is today, with an average age of 52, it needs to bring in 2 million people a year, age 25 and under, from now on. Germany let in 1 million people for 1 year and it broke the political system. It's not a sustainable option unless you've defined your national identity around it, like the United States has, and Australia has, and New Zealand has. Canada is very much a work in progress because we think of them as this happy socialist utopia full of immigrants right now. That's not how it was 35 years ago. That's not how it was 16 years ago. 16 years ago, Stephen Harper, the PM at the time, looked at the numbers like, we're going to be Germany in 5 years. We have to open the doors. We have to quintuple immigration now. And he did. And then it was held open under Trudeau. But after holding at that level for 14 years, Canada, a country of 31 million people when this started, now has 35 million people. And you bring in more than 10% of your population in a decade and a half, all the people who come in need certain things, including a house. You can't build out the housing stock that fast. And so Canadians who had been born there, whose parents, whose grandparents, whose great-grandparents had been born there, suddenly found themselves priced out of all the major markets. And that triggered a political backlash, which they still haven't come to terms with. The short-term solution was to close the doors. And so what the Trump administration is doing right now with universities, Canada did last year. It can be part of the discussion. It can be part of the solution, but it will always be a political issue.
Carol Ann, just because it's you.
Could you finish this by telling us what all these things that you talked about worries you most?
What worries me? You just want me to land on a, oh. What worries me the most? There are a number of things about the United States that no government can wreck. Navigable waterways, the ocean moats. But maintaining our technological superiority takes a lot of work and a lot of talent from a lot of places. And the university that most exemplifies American superiority over everyone is Harvard. And it looks like Harvard will be gone next year. 25% of their students are going to get kicked out because of the restrictions that were put in last week. All the grants are gone. All the research effort has been closed. The cooperation with the national labs is over. And Trump's trying to kill it. It is the greatest distillation of American intellectualism and science. And he's trying to make sure it's gone. That's emblematic of everything, in my opinion, that's wrong with this administration.